Welcome to Advent Conversations with Good Samaritan Church in Pinellas Park, Florida. Well, Bill and Rachel, thank you for being with me today. And we are talking about Mary again. This is Mary, the second part of that conversation. Now, images of the Madonna and Child, they're recognized and they're produced around the globe. And a lot of us find something very entrancing about that gaze between mother and child that's depicted in these beautiful works of art. What do you think that's about? Is that what we long for with God?
I think that is what we're looking for. We're looking for ourselves to be seen by someone truly, deep in our soul, by someone that is a protector of us, I believe.
I looked up some Madonna pictures on the internet and was struck by a lot of the time the child was not looking at mom but looking out at us or looking out, and that sort of caught my attention too. Looking at me, looking at us. So it was a different perspective. So I'm looking forward to some of the pictures you're going to show us.
Yeah, so we've got
Later.
Mary beholding Jesus, but then Jesus in many of these beholding us, looking at us with that same sort of adoration that a good mother looks at her new child with.
I think it's that transfer of the gaze. So, he got that from his mother, and now he can offer it to us to make us feel safe.
Well, and that's for most of us, early in our life, first few days of our life, that's our first bonding experience. Our eyes will only focus at that about 12-inch mark, which would be about how far we are when we're held in our mother's arms or our father's arms, how far apart we are. And those first, face-to-face just gazes are how we initially bond with another being. I remember someone a while back describing God looking at us like that and just being riveted by that idea that God would look at us with that kind of just focus and adoration. I remember being kind of surprised by that when I had kids of my own, and how much you're just kind of like addicted to their face when they're first born. Like you can't look away. You just are so in love.
And there's so much intimacy in that gaze. We don't often walk around and gaze into other people's eyes. We will typically, if challenged to do that, we want to avert. Mm-hmm. So when you have trust and safety, it's easier to hold that.
Especially when we are in that person's arms, and they are much bigger than we are.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that is really intimate. Gosh, it's probably one of those very experimental psychology things, but I remember reading a while back that, if you sit and look into someone's eyes day after day for, several minutes at a time, you'll build more intimacy with them. There's something just about gazing at one another. Now, we have both ancient and contemporary renditions of the Madonna and Child, which depict them sometimes looking like marginalized mothers and children of our own world, poor, rejected racial minorities. Let me show just a few of those images. So like I said, just a few images. There are many, many more. How are these visions kind of a truer reflection of the Christmas story itself?
Well, I feel like most of those images depict some sort of strife or challenge, especially if we look closely in the background. Like one of the first showed, I saw a lot of graffiti, and kind of dirt, but in the background I saw a beautiful sunset, and there's also butterflies. And, a lot of these images show people traveling and struggling. And I think that's more accurate, that if God is in every one of us, then it's not going to be this picture perfect image of, purity and stability all the time.
Yeah, I was struck by that too, the sharp contrast, but with some of the earlier pictures I had seen, or paintings I had seen, where there were halos and they were religious icons, and the baby kind of looked a lot like me, white and blue eye. I don't have blue eyes, but blue eyed. Just so I could be comfortable with that setting. This is, is a challenging kind of image. That makes me kind of have to look more deeply and begin to think about the implications of who is being called forth there, and who Jesus is being connected with there, is connecting with there.
A lot of the images, if we're thinking back to the actual story, that wasn't an easy experience. There was lots of stigma and rejection and unsafe territory. And that's what's shown in some of these more modern images, like crossing the border and trying to get out of communities that may be unsafe.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we tend to kind of fluff and make all sparkly the Christmas story, and yet there's some real raw edges to it. Sometimes we forget or selectively choose not to read the hard parts of the story. But of course, there's the slaughter of innocents and the flight to Egypt, and they're coming from Nazareth, which is one of those real kind of marginalized places, kind of right on the edge there of where the Hebrew territory kind of came to an end, and the Greek and Roman territory kind of took over, and it's messy. The whole story, there's a lot of mess and scandal and people that are much richer characters, I think, than sometimes we give them credit for.
Yes. I think in the past, and in other times when I have been taught this story, it has been very sanitized and just been so joyful and beautiful and no problems at all. But I don't think that gives the depth of who these people actually were, which then reflects into the depth of who we all actually are.
Yeah, and some of these images we just looked at, I see these women who have been weathered by life, who are survivors, who have probably overcome a lot of challenges. These women who are fierce, the way a lot of mothers are, in protecting their child and bringing their child into the world. And yeah, I think we've sanitized a lot about the Christmas story, but I find a lot of hope and strength looking at the women in some of these images.
And they were many brown-skinned, darker skinned, which had been much more likely to be what Jesus looked like in reality, and Mary and Joseph. And you could see the poverty. Maybe they're wearing jeans, or very, not rich, spiffy robes.
Well, how do these kind of images of the Holy Family as more representing those who are marginalized, how does that push us to relocate the Christmas story from the places of privilege and transform it into good news for those on the margins?
Well, I feel like it's a lot more relatable, and it's empowering for people that are marginalized to know this is actually the truth here. That, your journey isn't less than or abnormal, or, because some people feel very far away from God if they feel like, well, I've gone through this and I've made this decision. And when you realize that, the Holy Family went through a lot of similar things or were surrounded by people that went through similar things, I think it actually makes people feel like they're normal. They're an average person that's allowed to be a part of, worship and the world and not an outcast.
It sort of helps put the focus on kind of the unjust structures that surround and imprison, I guess, Mary and Joseph and Jesus. And that I had the image of keeping people out instead of letting people in of the country, for example, and people without housing, without enough to eat, people in prison, that there was kind of a connection or identification.
Right, because if we really think about the stuff that the family went through, these are things that, your average person would probably reject. Do you have convictions? Have you ever been, judged? Do you not have a clean record? Oh, you were homeless or houseless for a period. You didn't have access to food. This would be considered a family on the margin.
You mean you took a trip and you didn't even make reservations at the
Exactly.
For that moment of levity.
Exactly.
Yes. Yeah, they're this family that has experienced struggle, that has and will experience trauma and having to basically flee for their lives. They're a family that has had to deal with scandal and gossip and probably shaming and all sorts of things along this journey. And then, of course, yes, arriving there in Bethlehem and there being no room at the inn.
Right.
That famous part of the story.
That's something that I think an average person with privilege would probably think is a little, different or maybe even absurd or unheard of. And yet, look who did it.
And that kind of speaks to the poverty in the story too, right? Because when you have enough money, you can almost always buy your way into somewhere, but they don't, and there is no buying yourself a place. Well, what do these images call us to this Christmas?
Well, again, I think to identify with the people that are outside on the margins who are hungry. Certainly the church is doing a good job of feeding those folks. There are also structures of injustice that are, especially in our society right now, that are keeping people out of work and they don't have place income and their housing is in danger. So to pay attention to that and not to those needs and not get caught up in the sort of traditional beautiful imagery and pageantry that we tend to associate with Christmas. Sweet music and beautiful decorations and nice clothes to really dress it up and eat some really good food.
Yeah, I think it calls us to, look beyond, who's in our home or in our kind of little pocket community, and really doing a deep dive into empathy and looking at people and questioning if inside we have any ideas about who we feel like deserves Christmas spirit or the joy of Christmas, and maybe who we think doesn't, and really challenging ourselves on why that is. And realizing that, kind of like Bill said, that Christmas doesn't have to be, singing a tune and dressed to the nines. It could be someone, eating hot dogs with their sibling. Like, it doesn't have to look the way that we think it needs to be, to have the heart of Christmas in it.
I think about that that gaze and being called, each of us, to gaze at those that we might ordinarily look past. I remember reading a while back a study they had done about how much direct eye contact people who are homeless receive in a day. And sometimes they go 24 hours without anyone making direct eye contact. and thinking, there's a lot of people, each of us have different different people that we look past, but there's a lot of people that each of us looks past, dismisses for one reason or another, and the pause to gaze at those on the margins,
Right.
to really,
If I look into their eyes, then I might have to connect with them and do something,
right.
make a difference in their lives.
yeah,
I don't want to do that.
Exactly. But if we don't,
If
then
we,
it's easier for us to objectify them, as I call it, and just see them as, like a piece of furniture or part of the side of the road. But if we look at them, kind of ignore the story, see the soul. Once you see the eyes, then you're starting to learn more about what's gone on for them.
this is a real human being here, and in a lot of pain.
well, shifting gears a little bit, tell me about Mary's Magnificat. It's in Luke chapter 1, verses 46 through 55. What is Mary's vision of God and what God is doing in the world?
God loves me, a poor woman. I'm not connected with any of the political or religious leaders. I'm really an outsider here. And yet God has chosen me to work through me. And God is going to focus on people like me. He is already focusing on people like me by choosing me for this task, this role that He's given me, God's given me. And the people on the margins are going to be lifted up and fed and taken care of. And the people on top are just going to be it's a harsh vision, going to be pushed away, pushed down. Things are going to be kind of flipped around. It's a very powerful image, and I think kind of an image that gets repeated in terms of her mission, Jesus' mission, the mission of the child that I'm bringing into the world is going to have this mission.
I think it's very much a song of hope for the oppressed. If you look deeply into what's being said, I feel like it's telling people like that they won't be forgotten and that this world is for them.
Yeah, it's this beautiful grand vision of kind of what we call the divine reversals that Jesus was all about, the first becoming last and the last becoming first. And her very poetic song, her kind of exclamation here, it echoes really in so many ways, Jesus' Beatitudes in the Sermon on the Mount. Like you said, Bill, this lifting up of the lowly, the marginalized, raising them up and asking everyone else to take a back seat. Well, how does this vision of hers speak into our world today?
This has been a year that really sort of, in some ways, I guess for me, I'm aware of just having it pushed into my face with the Black Lives Matter, the kind of lifting up of the injustices that I'm seeing in a much deeper way in terms of the racial injustice in our country. It goes all the way back to the beginning till now, still going on in some ways. The injustice of the COVID virus, who gets sickest, who dies the most, the poverty of folks, and who's being evicted, who's losing, who doesn't have enough to eat, it's just kind of lifts up what's going on this year, forces or helps me kind of put together, I guess, the Christmas story in 2020, which I had never, I've never said that one before. I've been wanting to get a run away from 2020 as fast as I could, but this is kind of linking the Christmas story to 2020 and the experiences, not so much for me, but for so many people around.
Yeah.
As I was looking into it, I realized that although I was familiar, with this text, that, I kind of wanted to give myself a refresher, and I came across an interesting piece of how this was often kept from oppressed people. This part was banned from being sung or read in India under British rule. It was banned in Guatemala in the 80s. And I think that kind of says everything that we need to know, that this was often kept from people that really needed to hear it. So that tells you how powerful it is and who and what it's for,
Mm.
by and for, really.
Thank you, Rachel. I didn't realize that. Thank you.
Didn't either. What you're saying is kind of, I can see that message is very frightening and scary, and it's a message I wouldn't want to hear or don't want to hear as a person in power.
Right? You don't want people to know that there could be something different if you want to keep them blind to whatever system you're trying to control them under.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think about this pandemic, and I've read a lot about, this has exacerbated the disparities between the haves and the have-nots. It's exacerbated the disparities between, those who tend to work a lot of the minimum wage positions versus those who work office jobs and can just now work at home and have their groceries delivered and all of that. There's a lot of people who are losing everything, man. The line out of our food pantry of cars today was incredible. It went all the way to Park Boulevard. And just the need is incredible right now. And yet you read about these CEOs and other people who are making bank on the pandemic, and their profits have increased a lot over the last year. And I think it is scary for those in positions of power and privilege to hear things could all be flipped on their head, reversed. And yet that's such good news for those who are struggling, who are not in places of privilege, who are experiencing oppression or poverty or racism or so many other things. Well, why is it significant that God enters the world through what will be perceived by many as a scandal, actually a series of scandals?
I kind of, in a way, would say what I've just said, that it says that God is coming to those on the margins, and the religious leaders it's a scandal, and we don't want to hear that message. People in power, we don't want to hear that message. We're blind to it, and we're unwilling to connect or listen to that. God, Mary's not one of us, so this baby can't have anything to do with us. So it's a scandal that they're even talking about this being the Son of God. That's insane. Messiah, that's insane. He can't be from God, because if it is, then I'm in big trouble. And I don't want to acknowledge that. I call it a scandal. I try to push it away.
I think it makes sense, because I think, what Jesus's and God's work is about is pulling away the veil, getting the smoke screen cleared, and really pointing to the difficult truths that we all have to, look at within ourselves and in our community. So I think that it just makes sense that it's not going to be, peaceful and easy. It's going to be challenging and cause some turmoil.
I think a lot, and I hear this from a lot of people who are hungry for God, hungry for that peace, hope, love, and joy that we say the Christ child embodies. And there's this belief among a lot of us that our lives we have to get them all cleaned up, make them picture perfect, for God to be able to enter in. And in this story, it's a affirmation and a reminder that God enters into the mess, into the ugly, the broken, the not beautiful, comes into the midst of it. Well, anything else either of you wanted to share about Mary?
It's a pretty scary story. In a way, it's funny to say that, but in a way, and very powerful, very deeply powerful. And I think some of the new paintings that kind of bring the reality of who Mary is and was, and who Jesus was back then, is very challenging and important. An important word for me as a white privileged American to hear. I need to see it and hear it.
Yeah.
Trying to put myself in really any member of the family's shoes. If if you really think about it, I don't know if I can assure myself that I could survive such a situation, you know? But if you really think about kind of the grit and the effort and the bravery that it takes to get through everything, and it was one after the other difficulties, very isolating. I mean, it really takes something, and we're seeing that reflected in so many people out there.
I love that word you used, grit. The grit in the story, the grit in our lives right now. It's taken all of us a lot of grit to get through right now.
Yes.
And grit is kind of an interesting double entendre. What? It's the gritty stuff that kind of gets in our, and it's also the grit that gives us kind of a courage to go forward.
Right.
Well, thank you both for this wonderful conversation on Mary. Thank you for joining us for Advent Conversations as we continue on the journey of this season.